Okay, hi everyone, and thank you for tuning to our event today. I would like to welcome all of you and also welcome to those who are joining us for the first time. It is absolutely fantastic to have you, and thank you for registering in our event. My name is Abdurrahman Khalid, a representative of the Energy Institute Young Professionals Network. Before we start this presentation, please be aware that the webinar might be extended for another 15 minutes to answer more of your questions, if any. At the end of the presentation, we're going to have a Q&A panel session with all of our speakers. You can pose those questions throughout the session in the chat box or question box below, and those will be addressed during the panel question session. Please state your name, affiliation, and also the name of the speaker you're targeting your question to. We will answer as many questions as possible. So with that, I would like to have a small overview of today's topic with the title of Energy Transition. What will the regional energy mix look like in 2050? So since 2000, the overall energy demand has grown in Asia by more than 80%, and where the main growth has been met by doubling in fossil fuel use. Oil is the largest element in the regional energy mix, largely for power generation, which has been the fastest growing. However, in 2019, around 90% of the power generated in the region came from conventional sources, such as coal, gas, and hydro, while renewables contributed less than 10%, according to the research firm IHS Markit. So, what is the expected energy mix in 2050? So, I would like to introduce our speaker for today. To begin with, Mr. Peter, who is based in Singapore. Peter is a leading representative of the Energy Institute in Asia Pacific region. Despite a long career in oil and gas industry, mainly with BP in the upstream oil and gas, Peter is now a strong advocate for energy sector career in the oil and gas industry need to transition towards a cleaner and greener future with a particular focus on promoting resources and operational efficiencies within the context of creating a more circular economy. In addition to his role with the EI, Peter also worked as an independent consultant and executive coach for a number of international organizations on those subjects and their strategic implication. While for the second speaker of the day, Mr. Hussein, who is based in Malaysia, Hussein is the founder of the Oil Industry Insight. He is an oil and gas industry professional recognized and featured on LinkedIn as an oil and gas industry expert with more than 350,000 followers. He is passionate about sharing knowledge, turning information, data, intelligence into insight and analysis, creating value to investors, traders, and decision makers. And now we would like to move to our second page of the presentation by starting highlighting about the Energy Institute and what we are. So according and as stated here, the Energy Institute, we are the professional body for a global industry, delivering good practice and professionalism across the breadth of sector through knowledge and skills development. And what is the Energy Institute? What is the history, maybe a little bit of that? So the Energy Institute is a professional organization for engineers and other professionals in energy-related fields. The Energy Institute was formed in 2003 with the merger of the Institute of Petroleum dating back to 1913 and the Institute of Energy dating back to 1925. The Young Professionals Network is a part of Energy Institute acting as the hub for tomorrow's energy leaders. Our mission is to draw together cross-discipline energy professionals from a diverse background to learn about and discuss key energy issues. The Young Professionals Network is a collective of 15 international and regional branches. They engage in topical issues across the industry and continue expanding the professional network to benefit the development and career of its members. And now we would like to highlight slightly more about the Generation 2050. So the Generation 2050 is a new initiative formed by the Energy Institute, its global young professionals network, and our partners that aim to provide a platform for young professionals around the world to have a louder voice in the bigger debate about climate change, access to energy, and energy security, with the aim of distillating and amplifying a positive vision for a change in response to those urgent global challenges, conveying to today's energy leaders the views and options of those who will inherit the sector and planet after them, and inspire young people to stay in the sector and others to join it. So we want young professionals to be heard. So before I pass the floor to our first speaker, we are keen to make this session interactive so we can hear your views. And for that, we have prepared a few questions for you that will pop up on your screen during the session, and you will be able to answer them. So without further ado, please let me welcome Mr. Peter.
Thank you, Abdul, and good afternoon, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be invited by the EIYPN in Malaysia to give a brief talk on what I see as the future energy mix here in Southeast Asia by 2050. But before I start, let me disappoint you all by saying that my answer will be far from a clear one, as there are so many variables at play in this complex world we live in today that it's impossible to give a straight answer to the question. What I will start with, though, are those three-letter acronyms that you see after the title, BBB or BAU. BBB standing for Build Back Better, or BAU, which is business as usual. In other words, are we going to see a world that will go back to where we were prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, or will we begin to see a world that is beginning to change? Now, the production and consumption of energy accounts for around 2/3 of the annual global human-induced pollution, making the energy transition absolutely central to mitigating the major risks of climate change. And that obviously forms a key feature as to where I believe the energy transition needs to transition towards. Next slide, please, Pat. Now, within the context of the world today, and the context of COVID, and the context of sustainable development and climate change, I'd like to open up my remarks today by quoting something that the Secretary General of the United Nations, Ban Ki-moon, said many, many years ago, in April 2012, I believe, which was that energy is the golden thread that connects three most important things that allow human lives to prosper. Those being economic growth, social equity, and environmental sustainability. And during my presentation today, I'd like you to think about those three elements as wherever we live, each of these affects the way we should look at our energy mix and how our energy mix should be managed in the future. So think about those three things: economic growth, social equity, and environmental sustainability. Now here in our region, when we talk to climate change, let us remember that Asia Pacific is consistently the hardest hit by climate-induced disasters around the world. In 2019, out of the 15 $1 billion plus climate disasters, Africa accounted for around 2 billion of those disasters, Europe around 4 billion, America around 60 billion, but the Asia Pacific region accounted for something like about $70.6 billion worth of climate disaster. So this is a real problem, and it faces all of us today, and it is real. Now, this year was supposed to be an important year for climate change. Right now, COP26, which was the next main meeting after the Paris Accord, which I'm sure you've all heard of, was meant to happen. That has now been delayed by a year to November 2021, and is a result of COVID, and has therefore created a situation where everybody is now thinking what climate change means and how this will be affected by the economic dimensions of the energy transition that, quite frankly, have changed tremendously due to the extreme price volatility that we are now witnessing due to COVID and the volatilities in economic and geopolitical situations that we all face today. And these implications have major impact on the way we see the world develop as we move forwards, and major policy decisions for governments to make all over the world when it comes to issues related to energy, resources, and infrastructure development. So there's now a new focus on so-called the words sustainability. No longer do we think about sustainability just in terms of green and clean. We need to think about efficiency. We need to think about reliability. And above all, we need to think about resilience coming out of that pandemic that we have all faced in the world today. But before we start, let's think about three key issues that I'd like you to think very important. Firstly, that the future of this world, whether we like it or not, requires more energy. Markets will grow, and economics requires more and more energy in growing countries such as those here in Southeast Asia. So in order to grow and prosper, secondly, we need to think about the fact that we need safe, secure, affordable energy that enriches the lives that can create economies for the future. But within that context, this second point that I would make is very important. We live in a world where we have the haves and the have-nots. We have people that have enough economy and enough energy, the so-called first world countries, and those, to a certain extent, can manage their energy mix in a very different way to the markets, the so-called have-nots, where economic growth is still massive, and there are still large parts of the population that don't have enough energy yet to feed their economic growth. So that becomes a very important point for us to think about. And the third is the role of renewable energy, by which I mean wind, solar, and biofuels, which are absolutely by far likely to be the fastest growing source of energy over the next 20 years. But in terms of actually penetrating the global energy system, we will find that how they penetrate and where they penetrate will vary considerably from market to market. And that really brings me on to the final point, which is to say how they vary, and next slide please, Pat, will be very important, not only for the way we look at things, but for, as Abdul mentioned, you as the next generation of energy leaders in the energy transition. Because I can't rely, and I can't say more enough, that actually the way energy will be managed in the future will not only be down to people like me, but very much down to you, and you have a role in actually deciding exactly where the energy transition will go. Next slide, please. So before I begin, let me just talk a little bit about the economies of the world. And I love to show this slide, although it's now a 2018 slide, because it kind of gives you a feel for the size of the different regions and how the economies play within these worlds. And as you can see, the United States is one big blob. And clearly, you know, the issue of self-reliance on energy plays a very vast range in terms of making sure that they are protected. So whoever wins today, we will see a world, yes, maybe with more renewables, yes, with a little bit less, but certainly a world in the United States that will be focused on energy security. We see another world called Europe, where European countries are all more or less the same size and are more or less integrated when it comes to developing an integrated energy policy. But here in our Asian region, we see something different. And we see China, which is obviously growing and growing, and very shortly will become the size of the United States blob, plus India, of course, which has massive populations, but actually a relatively small economy, plus, of course, all our Southeast Asian countries that play a part, and Japan, etc. Now, how these energy mixes will be managed will be very different. And I like to think about this concept of the deglobalization of energy. If you think about energy and how it was managed in the past, it was managed by the US and Europe, and it was managed as a global commodity that was bought and sold, very much with Europe and the US responsible for how the world was managed. In tomorrow's world, we will see a very different model, where actually different regions will actually develop their own solutions to energy and the way things move forwards. Next slide, please. So as we look at this, we begin to start realizing that the energy mix is a slightly more complex problem than we might think. And these slides from BP, Statistical Review, on primary energy, by which I mean those resources that are used directly to create energy, really show us a picture that even though renewables have been highly invested in already between 2018 and 19, they still represent, within the Asia-Pacific region, a relatively small percentage of the mix. But it is a mix and a growth that will clearly rapidly increase as we look at the world tomorrow. But I think the other thing we should think about is also the fact that energy consists of two fundamental different components, one of which is energy related to electricity, which means obviously electrification and the need to electrify more. And today we already have technologies that allow us to electrify using renewables, using decentralized energy, using microgrid technology in a way that we certainly couldn't do 20 years ago. So electrification will play an increasing important role as we move forwards. But the second market that is also important is what I call the energy molecules, those energy resources that are directly needed for fuels for road freight transport and other high horsepower mobility on land, maritime, aviation, hydrocarbons for the chemical, steel and cement industry. And although conversion to hydrogen is something we can look at the future, those molecules are going to take a time before they begin to transition into decarbonized solutions. So the story, wherever we are, is one where electrification is king. We need to do as much as we can by the use of electricity, but we still have challenges and technical challenges when it comes to looking at how we manage the energy mix for those molecules that I just talked about right now. So all of that needs to be taken into account when we look at ASEAN, which is a diverse and dynamic region, which is growing after COVID, hopefully again by, around 5% a year, with a total population of around 622 million people. That's 8% of the world's population. We have very different economic fundamentals. Cambodia and Vietnam, historically in the last few years, have been the fastest growing markets. Singapore and Brunei have been the highest GDP capita in the region and have been stable. So they have a different view as to how they look at their energy policies going forwards. And we need to think about all of those elements within, next slide, please, Pat, the issue that is very often referred to as the energy trilemma, by which I mean three core components that every single government looks at when it makes decisions about how energy is managed. The first being energy security, making sure that we can provide secure energy that those that want it. The second one being that we can do it affordably, energy equity. And that's a very important area that I'll talk about just in a minute, because to my mind, that's where I see changes emerging within the ASEAN countries going forwards. And the third one, which we've already talked a little bit about, which is environmental sustainability, which is really all about making sure that we use energy and the resources that produce that energy in the most efficient and effective places. So all of those three things come into play when we begin to start looking at, next slide please, Pat, the elements that I think are very, very important for us to consider when we look at the energy mix going forwards. And the first of those, without a doubt, is money, economics. It's about looking at how we manage our economic growth going forwards. Without that, we don't have money to invest. And without investment, we can't build infrastructure and we can't build the energy out. So governments and people need to think about the dollar in their pocket, the rupiah in their pocket, whatever, and begin to start looking at ways and means of optimizing the economic model for how energy plays into that. And of course, tying into that very much is politics. How the politics of the world begin to start looking at these things. And you note that I put in the words international and local. And I think those are two very important distinctions. There are geopolitical issues, i.e. how we work as a region, the relationship between America and China, and all of those bigger issues that are at stake. But there's also local politics. And this is where I think economic empowerment is going to start seeing more of a role here locally, in local communities within the ASEAN than we have seen before. Because actually, historically, those local communities have been very poorly serviced by the energy providers of yesterday and offer great opportunity for us actually to develop economic growth for the future. And tied in with that, of course, are the technology issues, which are very important, like digitalization, electrification, I've mentioned, transportation, the circular economy and what we can do in terms of waste and the use of waste and resources, environmental factors like climate change, public health, food and health and food and drink, and then of course social factors, which are about creating social cohesion, creating well-being, both in an urban setting and a rural setting. And all of these issues will take place. So without further ado, I'll ask Pat to put a polling question up around those 5 issues, which I'd like you to answer. Which of those would you see as being the most important element in deciding the energy mix from your perspective? Economics, politics, technology, environmental factors, or social factors? Please have a vote. Next slide, please. I think we're doing the vote. Okay, so here we are. Right, now what am I going to talk about now? I'm going to talk about where I see the Asian economies moving to in terms of economics and politics while you're actually deciding where you're going to put your vote. In a minute, we'll have a look at the answer at the end of what I've said on this slide. But I think what I'm hearing from governments and politicians, whether it be in Indonesia, whether it be in Malaysia, whether it be in Singapore, are that they want to see a world that is beginning to start changing how we operate and manage in this country. A world where, for example, it's recognized that Thailand and Vietnam and countries like that are no longer going to survive by t-shirt manufacturing or manufacturing jeans or whatever. That now what we need to do is start creating more competitive interest in the way we look at how we create manufacturing hubs, more economic and more efficient ways of really creating competitive advantage for our countries. And the region's beginning to start thinking about this, not only from the point of view of competition between itself, but competition with the rest of the world, because supply chains are also changing, and we're beginning to develop more of an internal market for ourselves within the region, and we can rely less and less on global trade as being where economics will go in the future. The second, I think, is the fact that most countries now accept the fact that we do need to invest in green and sustainable infrastructure. Thirdly, obviously, digitalization and how that plays into infrastructure development and the management of that infrastructure becomes important. And as a result of that, people are beginning to start looking at reskilling and deployment at scale. And this is not only about people in cities, people working within oil companies, it's also about how do we improve fundamentally the way outlying communities operate. So, for example, agricultural communities in Southeast Asia are still operated relatively inefficiently. Just think of the difference that we could make if we could begin to start developing microgrids and more decentralized electricity and energy in fishing communities, agricultural communities, and the way we manage food and agriculture in the future. So these, I think, are actually going to be the fundamental areas that will make a shift in the way we look at the energy mix. I look at the vote here, and as you can see, 40% are saying economics is going to be the key issue. I think 30% are saying non-applicable. So not everybody has actually been in the poll, but there's clearly a big majority that agrees with me that politics and economics and politics, sorry, economics number one and politics number two, will be by far the two biggest issues that we'll begin to start looking at the day and how we'll move forwards. Next slide, please. So what will this look like? Very quickly, there's a roadmap. We are going to start, I hope, after COVID, seeing more coherent, stable policies being developed. I already see signs that there is more investment and more financing shifting into sustainable development, into decarbonization. And indeed, Petronas announced just a few days ago that they have now got a net zero target of their own. So here is the first national oil company in the region declaring a net zero target by 2050. We are seeing a shift, and it is a major shift towards low carbon energy systems and providing energy access for all. So I think we are seeing changes. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So out of all that, let's just summarize. I think what I see is a world where clearly the 3 Ps, people, planet, profit, economics, as has been rightly identified by the survey, are going to be absolutely key. But actually social welfare and environmental variables will all play a part in what sustainable means. And we will see a world where government will begin to start thinking about issues like quality of life, like the environment, like mobility, like society, in a slightly different way than we have in the past. And they will recognize that the world is no longer dominated by national oil companies and major multinational oil companies. It is dominated by a much more fungible mix that will form the solutions to electrification and molecules, as I described them before. Next slide, please. So finally, what do I think is needed? And this is my last slide. We need basically a number of different issues to emerge. And I think this is really the answer to where the energy mix will go. I think we need, firstly, better transparency when it comes to understanding how renewables can play into our markets. At the moment, we don't have enough information. We still need better, more transparent information on which to make decisions. And I'm hoping that governments will increasingly encourage standardization of information, more transparency of information on which to make decisions. The second one is power system flexibility, where I believe those that are not well served in today's grids around Asia, and if you go to Myanmar and Cambodia, of course, that's most of Myanmar and Cambodia, but if we go to Malaysia, there's already quite an effective grid. In Indonesia, the same, but not everywhere. So I think the idea that you actually begin to start looking at the not everywhere as a different type of energy system that can be operated on a more decentralized basis will be key. And I think that will affect how quickly we move to renewables and a more expandable, flexible power system for electrification going forwards. The third one, I think, is how much focus is put on energy use. So it's about customers and those that use energy becoming more aware and more recognize the need to be efficient. And I think that will happen as a result of a carrot and stick approach. I think governments increasingly coming out of COVID will penalize companies that are using inefficient energy and reward those that are doing a good job. And that will have a major economic impact on decisions making forwards. And then finally, I think what we all need to do, whether we be in Asia or the world as a whole, is recognize that we need to align what I have just said, energy and climate policies, as a central pillar for how we recover from COVID, because all of us, every economy in the world, will be short of capital coming out of COVID. The question, therefore, is how we invest the capital in the future as we come out of COVID to create a new world for ourselves that has more socio-economic events and capability for our populations, and allow us to grow more effectively, not only in our own countries, but the ASEAN region as a whole in the case of where we live today. So there we go. Thank you very much. Back to Abdul, and I'm looking forward to questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. As Peter actually mentioned, we have to find a sustainable, greener and cleaner energy, but also affordable, so that we can use it and, of course, utilize it, achieving the United Nations goals, and most importantly, benefiting the general population. As we also know that the general population will be having an additional 2 billion people by 2050. So these solutions are very important. With that, a simple reminder and a gentle reminder, please add your questions whenever you have one, add them to the question box, and we'll accommodate you as soon as possible. With that, I would like to welcome our second speaker for the day, Hussein Alahdal. Please welcome.
Thank you so much, Abdurrahman, and good afternoon, everyone. So today I will be speaking on the energy transition outlook, and more or less on giving you a closer look at Asia Pacific energy mix and what to expect in the future. Peter had mentioned a lot of great points out there. However, my presentation will be more into discussing. We will start first with giving you an outlook on an overview of what is the energy mix that we have today, and how did it change in the past, and what many organizations or research institutes are looking in the future, what they expect. I mean, because we have a diverse outlooks out there. Some they expect energy mix will change more into renewables. Some are quite conservative. So we will look at some of these. The one that I feel is the most reasonable, and then we will go more into the regional energy mix, because when we talk about the global energy mix, we're talking about all the regions as one, and that is a standard energy mix. But when we dig deeper into different regions and different countries, we will be surprised, you will be surprised to see how different are the energy mix for one region to another. And I'll explain to you why it is different, why it is that way. And we will look at the factors that affect or impact the energy mix for each region. Then we will go into my final slide, which is more into what I think, what is the current energy mix for Asia Pac, and what I think will be in 2050. So let's start with the first slide, which is more on the energy mix. Can you move to the first slide? Oh, okay, yeah, there you go. So you see, what I see currently is there is a quite enthusiasm out there in the market, and everybody's talking about green energy, and everybody's talking about we want to go into a cleaner, more renewables and everything. But what we are missing, or the misunderstanding, especially in the public, is the fact that when we talk about the energy mix, it's totally different when we talk about the power generation mix, because power generation is more into the electricity, but the energy mix, it covers a huge sectors, which I will explain in a while. So when we look at the energy mix itself, it's more or less on it's a combination of various energy sources that to meet the energy needs for either for a region or for the world. So when we talk about the energy mix for the world, we're looking at the first is number one, which is the oil, and then the natural gas, the coal, hydro, nuclear, and renewables. And all these are primary energy. And then we go into the secondary energy. And these are products made from the primary energy. We're talking about biofuels, electricity, heats, and petroleum products, mainly used in which is the second phase when we talk about the transportation, commercial, industrial. There are so many uses for it. So when we look at the energy mix, it is very important that we define what is the energy mix. You see people out there talking about the energy, we will go renewable full. I mean, we will go, the energy mix will become totally renewable. We want to get rid of oil. But when we look at it, you can have an energy mix, a global energy mix that is 100% renewable. Not at all. You can't have that. It is possible to have a power generation mix that is renewables. That is fine, because it's mainly about electricity, and some countries are going into that direction. But when we look at the energy mix, it is totally impossible to have that. And now that we explained the energy mix and you understand it a bit, let's have a look at how the current energy mix, global energy mix, look like. So that's bringing me to my next slide. So when we look at the global energy mix in total, what we are looking at is you have 84.3% of the global energy mix back in 2019. It all came from fossil fuel. That covers the oil, the coal, the gas, and you can see the percentage. Oil is the biggest energy source, and then you have the coal. Oil was 53.1. Coal was 27, and we have the gas at 24.3. Then beside that, we have somewhere around 17. That would be 16.7. That is 50.7. That is coming from renewables. So it is quite small percentage. And when we look at it in a global perspective, if we can go to the next slide, please. Okay, yeah, okay, there you go. So in a global perspective, you have the fossil fuel still a dominant energy source, 80%. Now, when we look at the outlooks that are coming from, say, for example, International Energy Agency and BP, most of them, like back in 2019, they were all looking at oil will still be dominant, fossil fuel will still be dominant. But what happened over the past 2019 to this year, then we saw a quite aggressive shift in the public perception or in the media. And suddenly most of these companies, they started to change their outlooks, which doesn't really make any sense. Because the thing is, if you look at the past, now if you start, you can see in this slide, I put both of them together and the chart. One of them is looking at which is the primary energy consumption by fuel. Now you will see since the 1970 up to 2010 or 2020, you will see the oil it was still growing up until today, and it grew last year. But when you look at the second graph, where you can see the share of primary energy, you will see the oil declining. That decline, most people look at it as the oil consumption is declining. It's not. The oil consumption is growing. The gas consumption is growing. The coal consumption is growing, which is the most shocking news. That up almost a century after the discovery of oil, we still use coal. And when we look at the Asia Pacific in general, you will see most of the coal, 70%, almost 70% of the global coal consumption is used in Asia Pac. So that is what made me reach to a conclusion, which I will share with you at the end about what I think about the regional energy mix for Asia Pac. Why coal will still be there? Because as you can see, since the past and up until today, we couldn't manage to phase out coal from the global energy mix. Now, you look at the slide again, back into 1980 and 90, renewables started from the 1970. There was a slight growth, and it started to grow slightly. Now, most of the news out there, they always put it as an energy transition, and they make it look like by next year we will have a totally different energy mix. That will never happen. Down the road, 20, 30 years down the road, we will still have the same energy mix. The only difference is the percentage. How much oil will still be there? Oil will still be growing. Some, they say 2030 it will start to peak and decline, but I totally disagree on that. There is a great growth of in consumption from Asia Pac, developing countries. Most of these developing countries will drive the consumption of oil, the gas. The coal is the thing that we still, up until today, we see a growth for it, so, which is one of the high intensive carbon emission energy source. Now, if we go to the next slide, please. Okay, so now we have defined the energy mix. We've looked at the global energy mix and what happened over the past and what is expected to go in the future. Now, we go deeper into I'll dive deeper into the Southeast Asia Pacific. But before we do so, I want to give you more an overview on the changes of the regional energy mix. Now, for each region or each country, when we looked at the global energy mix, we saw there is a standard of numbers, like the oil is 33, the gas is 27. But when we go into deeper into each region, you will see it totally different, which we'll see in the next slide. But before we do so, let's look at the factors. Now, for each region or each country, their energy mix within that country depends on various factors. And some of it are specific to that country. Others is more related to the resource availability, the types of fuel that are needed, the regional and country-specific policies, technology development, energy security, societal preference, and geology. Now, when we look, let's take, for example, resource availability. The resource availability, if you look, for example, at Middle East, they have a lot of reserves, oil and gas, and they have abundance of this resource. It doesn't make sense for them to go for renewables. They will start. It is a trend. It's a global trend. They will start to do it. But the problem is they have too much oil. Now, let's take Southeast Asia. Particularly, we're looking at China, India, and Indonesia. These countries, they have an energy mix that is totally different from countries in North Sea, from countries in North America. And the reason is because they have totally different resource availability. There is basically 2% of the global oil reserves is in Asia Pacific. China has somewhere around 15 billion barrel of oil, but the problem is they have different types of fuel, which are a lot of it, and then they have lack in terms of other fuel. So what the focus is, countries will tend to use the fuels that they have a lot of it. China will use coal because they have it everywhere. Australia is building its capability in terms of natural gas production, LNG, because they have a lot of it, and we will see growth there because of that. Now, when we go to the extent of and the type of energy needs that need to be met, this comes back to what type of the transportation, industrial activities, the growth, and we see a lot of growth here in Asia Pacific, and that will lead. You see, So, for example, I give you an example, which was last year, 2019. Both Europe and North America, we saw the energy mix, the growth of their energy mix was down, but the growth was here in Asia Pacific, and that is because of what is happening in China, the development and all these activities that are driving the growth of China. Now we look at the technology and the regional and country-specific policies, and these are mainly the policies that are driven by the governments, who they like, the country that they like, who they are worried about, the kind of economic, social, demographic, environmental, political factors that drives their decision making, and that impact their energy mix. Because in Europe, they're worried about Russia. There is an internal motive that they want to build their own energy source. They want to divert into renewables because they can have it in country instead of importing from outside. Energy security, it is the same thing with what I talked about. It's about you making sure that you don't rely on other countries, and that impact your energy mix. Now, with all these factors, let's look at the next slide. And before I do that, before we look at the next slide, I would like to ask my question, which is, based on what I explained to you, the factors, what is the energy? What do you think is the largest share of energy in energy mix in Asia Pacific? Will it be oil, gas, coal, renewables, nuclear, or hydro? So you can choose, and we will compare with my last slide, which will give you a more clear overview. So let's move to the next slide. Now, in this slide, what you will see, we saw in the previous one where oil is 84% of the globe, the fossil fuel, and oil is 33. But here you will see totally different ratios. Now, in North America, you have oil somewhere around 34, 38. But in Asia Pacific, you have it somewhere around 28. Coal in North America is very small, somewhere around 11%. But if you look at Asia Pacific, you will see it's somewhere around 44%. And that is what I've been talking about. Different region will have different availability of resources, different energy sources that are available to it, and they will go for it. Middle East, if you look at the Middle East, it's basically green and red, because they have too much oil and too much gas, and that is what their energy mix is all about. Europe, you will see Europe going more into renewables, and North and Central America, they still have the oil. It's part of their energy mix. The gas is also part of their energy mix. Coal is dropping in Europe. Renewable energy is growing, but it's only in this particular part of the world, in these two areas. But in the rest, we see it growing, but we don't see it in the same percentage. And the reason is because each region and each country has their own factors that impact the decision that they make when it comes to their energy mix. Now let's go to the next slide, which is mainly more. Okay. So if before we go to my next slide, I think it's better before. Yeah. Let me show you, if you can just show us the answers. So I guess most people, they see no answer, but the biggest, I guess the biggest percentage is going for natural gas. So now here is my final slide, which talks about what I think will be the Asia Pacific regional energy mix. Now let's start with 2019, where we are right now today. So for 2019, oil made up 28% of the global of the regional energy mix for Asia Pacific. Gas made around 12%, and coal is the largest, 48%. Now, and then we have nuclear 2% and hydroelectricity 4%, renewables around 6%. Renewables have been growing, and that is at the cost or the expense of coal and oil. But the thing is about Southeast Asia, there is this kind of, there is too much coal here, and there are countries who still have oil, and there are countries who still have gas. So going forward down the road, in 2050, what I still see is we will still have their energy mix. The energy mix here will still depend 25% on oil. 20% will be coming from gas. So the reason why I see that gas is growing is because there are a transition from coal power generation into gas. It will happen, and gas is considered as a clean, somehow a little bit clean energy compared to oil. And then we will have, but the problem with 2050 assumption for myself is that there will still be a lot of consumption when it comes to coal, and that is quite difficult to change. I don't see it. I can't believe that Asia Pacific down the road, 2030 or 2040, will have a smaller percentage than this. We will see a growth when it comes to renewables. It can double, more than double, which is 14%. I expected. 7% will go for hydroelectricity, and then nuclear will be 5%. But when we look at this assumption, the reason why I reached to this assumption is we see China is growing and is growing aggressively. So when we look at now, they're setting up their they call it a 14th 5-year plan. This the previous 13th 5-year plan limited the coal consumption at 1,100 gigawatt. Now this year, with all this energy transition and going forward to 2050 and all the plans and all the countries are going net zero, Southeast Asia or China in particular, which why I talk more about China is because whatever happens in China will change, will impact or dominate the whole percentage when it comes to Southeast Asia. So what happens is we still see them, they will increase the coal power generation from 1,100 limits to 1,300, and it's expected. Most of the institute in China expect that the coal will still be growing. So we will still have growth for oil, but the percentage, when I mentioned that 25% of oil, it doesn't mean that oil consumption will drop. It more or less is it will be shifted with a growth in another source of energy. But because the total energy consumption is growing, so the percentage for oil will still be small. However, it will still be growing. Okay, so going forward into 2050, this is, well, you will see some studies or reports showing that things could be different, and it could be different. But if we are talking about the power generation mix, but when it comes to the energy mix, there are so many parameters that impact that other than the electricity. And you look at the transportation sector, you look at the residential sector, industrial sector, all these, and with the petrochemical and all these sectors that are highly dependent on oil and gas, it will still allow fossil fuel to still be there. So you can, but what I see it is fossil fuel by 2050 will still make up, I mean, this is my view, is it will still make up somewhere around 75% of Asia Pacific energy mix. Okay, thank you so much. That was my my last slide, I guess.
Thank you, Hussein. As Hussein actually mentioned, oil and gas, but also coal, will be the main energy source that will power our life. So with that, actually, we'll be jumping into our discussion session for today. We'll be having mainly few questions to have the opinion from our respectable speakers. So as you can see, the first, as the title here suggests, cradle to grave of wind turbine and solar panel. So we can see that the raw material that solar and as well as wind turbine that are made up of tend to be very simply different ores, different materials, and they have to a certain degree good purity, such as, for example, the silica for the solar panel. And so the first question for the discussion will be, does the clean energy generated from solar offset the negative impact during mining and manufacturing process for solar panel? So we'll like to have Peter's opinion regarding this. So please welcome.
Abdul, thanks for the question, and it's a really interesting one, and it really comes down to this issue again of transparency. We do need to find a way to look at life cycle carbonization issues, not only from a hydrocarbons perspective, but also from a renewables perspective. Now, so the answer to your question is, there is no question in the life of an asset, you know, as long as the solar panels last for 10 or 15 years, that they are cleaner than the hydrocarbons in terms of carbon, in terms of pure decarbonization, because they don't emit. And emissions are effectively the focus of decarbonization efforts. So to me, the answer is yes. From a life cycle perspective, they are cleaner energy if one believes that what we are all aiming for is a net zero target. Now, the other part of this issue is back to what Hussein was saying, which actually I don't entirely agree with, is that decarbonization, in inverted commas, is real. I don't believe that even companies in Saudi Arabia or Qatar can ignore the fact that decarbonization is going to become a part of what they have to struggle with. So the question, therefore, is the cost of decarbonization. We're back to economics. And there is no question, for example, right now, if you look at the cost of wind in the UK or the cost of solar, even in places like the Middle East, it is cheaper to use solar cells than it is to dig oil and gas out of the ground. So economics is king. And economics is what will drive what we do in terms of wind turbines and solar panels, and how we then turn economics into policy when it comes to government going forwards.
Thank you, Peter. What would you like to say, Hussein, regarding the same question?
Yeah, so you see, the thing about the energy mix and judging the renewables, it's not about us saying that renewables is good or bad. I mean, when it comes to the energy mix, you're looking at the total. I mean, you need every source of energy. The problem is with all the propaganda that comes with the renewables, that makes the renewables look like it is clean and green. It is not. There is a cost for everything. Oil, I mean, oil is a source of energy. It is good. It is used everywhere, and because of the cost, because of its uses, it covers every source of our life. It has a negative side. We can control it. There is an efficiency improvement. There are a lot of things that can be improved. But when it comes to renewables, there is also the same thing about it. We can say the same thing about it. It may not. I mean, the carbon footprint may not. It is clean to a certain extent, but the problem with it, especially now because we are starting in this area, is the regulations. Now, I mean, some of your pictures here shows the negative impact of it, which now when they were building that turbine farm or whatever you want to call it, I don't think they put a study for the decommissioning of it. And that is the reason why we see a picture like this at the end of the life. Now, when you look at the solar panel, do we now, when we build a solar, when we get rid of a green cover to build a solar energy farm with losing a huge land area cover, a green cover, have we done any study to evaluate the impact of removing the green cover before we do that? That's number one. Now, and it comes down to the thing that we are enthusiastic about it. we're just excited about what is happening. Everybody's happy. But the problem is we're missing one big problem, which is there are so many companies out there that are trying to make money out of this. They do not care about the environment. It is the last thing they care about. And you can see it everywhere. It's just about the money. So the thing about everybody has to take their own responsibility, starting with the government. There should be regulations in the same way that there are regulations for oil. I mean, you see the stringent regulation when it comes to the offshore safety. We have a lot of problems, and there are spills here and there, but it's accident, and it costs companies billions, and you can ask Bibi about that. But the thing is, when it comes to renewables, we want to go there, but we should make sure that it's regulated, that you make sure that, because end of the day, not only the oil, it's also renewables. It has to be an energy, and there is a cost for it. So we should make sure that the cost for all the energy is really regulated, we don't support renewable at the cost of destroying the environment.
So if I could just quickly come back, Abdul, there have been studies done on the costs of decommissioning of solar and wind panels. So, wind power turbines. Now, most of the wind turbines are actually using materials that can be safely put in the ground. So actually, they're relatively clean when it comes to decommissioning. Solar panels have a different problem because they have various metals and minerals in them that basically, unless recycled, can be a problem when it comes to disposal. So work is being done on there, but I agree with Abdul, with Hussein, sorry, that there is a need for closer understanding of regulations and an alignment when it comes to what we really mean by end-of-life panels and utilization of different forms of energy. And there needs to be a level playing field. You're absolutely correct.
Yeah.
Thank you to Peter and as well as Hussein. So we'll move to the second question for our discussion session, and this is going to be more related to the oil and gas industry. As you can see here, the picture, hopefully it can explain some points, but jumping straight away to the question, so we can see a multiple incident in the oil and gas industry in the past few years. Based on your experience, both Hussein, we'll start with Hussein and then with Peter. What are the areas, maybe, as you can see, we have upstream, midstream, and downstream. So what is the area that maybe we can enhance in the oil and gas industry so we can produce maybe a cleaner energy, or maybe even suggest new technology that potentially can make the energy that comes from the oil and gas a cleaner, maybe such as carbon capture, potentially, let's say, could be the answer. So we'll leave the floor to Hussein first. What would you like to say regarding that?
Yeah, so when we look at talking about the climate change and all the issues that we are expected to face, that in oil and gas industry can help a lot when it comes to carbon capture and storage. I mean, we talk about the EOR. So I will start with that first, because people just look at the oil industry as the dirty and the bad. But when we look at it, especially now they're doing it in the North Sea, they're using this carbon capture where you have an oil reservoir where you can inject the CO2 into it, and it helps you produce more oil, and at the same time you reduce carbon emissions. So this is one thing the oil industry can help the climate change. Now the second thing, which when you talked about what other things that can be done, I see flaring as the biggest issue, which is you will see it everywhere, as in the Middle East, in the North Sea. Flaring should stop, and there should be a lot of new technologies that can help stop the flaring of oil and gas. Oil spill, when it comes to it, it has to come with the regulations. Maintenance, checking on the ships and all these kind of things, and making more regulation when it comes to safety. That the accident, what happened in PP in Macondo in the Gulf of Mexico, it has transformed the oil and gas industry. There are more stringent regulation when it comes to oil spills now, but accidents happen everywhere, and it will happen in renewables. It will happen everywhere. We have to deal with it. We have to improve, learn from the past lessons, and improve our operations. efficiency improvement and reduction, and when you look at all the companies right now, like Equinor, Petronas, like you mentioned, all the net zero, all these companies, by net zero, we don't mean that they won't produce oil. They will still be producing oil. It's just a matter of balancing what the emissions that they produce and what they can remove. So there are so many things to improve operationally, efficiency-wise, and all companies are doing it right now. They are really transforming. So we can't just say that we have to move it to renewables because oil is bad. Oil will still be there. Companies will improve. Operation will improve. So that's what I think.
Thank you. And what would you like to say about that, Peter?
So on the one hand, I agree with Hussein. I think probably the most important issue here is carbon capture, utilization and storage. But I'll put a slightly different spin on this. To me, the key problem, and it comes back to what Hussein was talking about, coal versus oil versus gas, etc., is also who pays for it. Okay, and here I have a problem, and it comes back to your point about looking at the supply chain, upstream, midstream, downstream. The resource extractors are really good at saying emissions and carbon are not our problem, they're customers. We dig it out of the ground. What the customers do is up to them. The fact of the matter is that decarbonization is a problem for the resource extractors and for the transporters and for the users. Now, if you add the price of carbon to a coal-fired power station, both in Japan or in China, and what the coal miners need to do for carbon capture, utilizations and storage, basically coal is totally out of the money. And there is no way that Hussein's forecast for coal to remain at the percentage that is at in 2050 can hold true. So back to economics. If you look at carbon capture, utilization and storage and the need for getting resource extractors to get more serious about carbon capture, about emissions, and to deal with the problems at the upstream end of the business, then I think we're reaching the solutions we need to for 2050. If we don't, we have a real problem in the world. And that's really the problem that we need to face today.
Thank you, Peter, for your answer. So with this, we have actually concluded the discussion session. And now I'll be opening the floor for the participant to answer their questions. So we'll be actually answering 2 questions because we are short on time. So one question will be given to each of the speakers. We'll begin with Peter. So the question states, solar and wind depends on storage. So to keep energy. So how can we, or will we be seeing a development in storage technologies such as graphene battery or supercarbon battery in order to eliminate the current issue of storing the energy?
So again, yes, I agree that lots of new technologies that need to be developed, especially when you start looking at grid scale technology and storage and reliability issues. So, the faster we develop these storage issues, the better. But in fact, I think the solution is somewhat different to worrying too much about energy storage. On the one hand, solar and wind do have a problem with intermittency. But another way of solving the problem is if we are creating too much power, it creates solution to the molecules that we need to actually start looking at, not the electrification side. So back to my presentation. If we can start producing green hydrogen with the excess of solar and wind, as opposed to storage, because we've got too much electricity, that's a lovely problem to have. And I think that's the world that we are ultimately going to move to. So storage is an issue now. It's a transient issue. But at the end, once we get to a more renewables mix, renewables will begin to start giving us a solution to actually the way we can start using biofuels more effectively, hydrogen more effectively, to create petrochemicals. And that will take carbonized products like oil, like gas, like coal and hydrocarbons generally out of the money again. So over time, and it's probably post 2050, the solution is through renewables, and more renewables. And I'm a true believer in that, even though my history is in oil and gas.
Totally agree on that point, specifically with the experience that you have. Thank you for that, Peter. And so we're going to jump into our last question, which will be directed to Hussein. So the question states is there any specific oil reserve? Because we believe that we have a specific oil reserve currently. So maybe with more development in conventional oil method, we'll be seeing, are we going to be seeing more oil reserve? And specifically, this question is asked because there is worries that unlike the renewable, there is a limited quantity for the oil and gas that we have.
Yeah, sure. So when we talk about reserves, I mean, let me just give you a very quick story. Back in in the 1970s, there was a theory in US when it comes to the peak oil theory. So, and it says that US oil production would peak in the 1972, and it did. So now what happened was that people believed in it, and they bought it. And back in 2005, we saw the US started to increase its production. And it went from a country that is dependent on the Middle East for its energy into a net energy export and import. So what we see is that you can't believe what you hear out there. There is now studies or report that says now instead of the consumption will be. I don't buy it. Now, when it comes to the reserve, we see it growing, and if you want to check that, you can go and look at BP statistical review. Now, back in the 1990s, it was 1.4. Last year, in 2008, it was 1.6 trillion barrel of oil. Now, this year, in 2019, it grew to 1.7. So reserve is growing. There is too much reserve out there. The only thing that is limited and which we don't know is the technology. The more we develop new technology to discover, there will be more oil out there. In fact, now to give you just a very quick idea, when we talk about the oil, the reserves, we always abandon most of the wells with just 40% of the oil recovered from that well. 40%. So sometimes it went up to 70%, 60% in the North Sea when it comes to Equinor, but the recovery factor is too low. The moment that we increase the recovery factor, there will be too much oil out there. When it comes to offshore, deep water, there is too much oil to go and find. So when it comes to reserve, oil is not a renewable, but there is too much oil out there.
Thank you very much, Hussein, for your very detailed answer. So we came to the end of our session for today. I would like to remind everyone that once we have completed the presentation today, you will be directed straight away into a page where you can fill a survey regarding Generation 2050. And of course, there will be a record of this webinar will be available following this webinar in specific. You also might be able, if you like, to visit YouTube channel under the name Energy Institute, where you'll be able also to find the session. You can watch it as you like. So I would like to say a very special thanks to Peter and Hussein for this amazing session and sharing. Again, thanks to our amazing participant for joining us today as well. And lastly, not to forget our special thanks to our sponsoring partners, Repsol, Sinopec, IBM, Nipton Energy, and Ørsted. So with that, I would like to conclude this session and have a nice day ahead.
Thank you.